Okay, this is a video response to Epydemic on the problem of evil. I know this is supposed to be a political channel, but I figured I'd make a video on religion, so here it goes.
Now, this argument claims that it is logically impossible that evil and God can exist simultaneously. This means that there is no possible scenario in which God and evil could be logically compatible. Now, due to the second law of logic, the law of non-contradiction, something cannot be true and false at the same time. This means that if there is even one possible scenario in which an all-loving, all-powerful God and evil and suffering can coexist, then the logical problem of evil is destroyed.
Okay, not exactly. I would change that to if there is at least one actualized scenario where God and evil can coexist, this argument fails. For example, let's say, hypothetically, that God and evil can coexist in a scenario where I have 10 million subscribers. The argument would still would work in the context of this reality because I clearly don't have 10 million subscribers. So while God would still be logically possible, it would be safe to conclude that he does not exist, and thus the argument would be successful.
So, let's destroy it. Now, ironically, just admitting that it is possible that God has morally sufficient reasons for allowing evil would mean that it is possible that God and evil can coexist.
True, but if a scenario where God could have morally sufficient reasons for allowing evil to exist has not been actualized, then this argument still proves that God does not exist in reality, even if God and evil could theoretically be logically compatible. You'll see why this is relevant in a few minutes.
So now I'll provide a detailed example of this. 1. Free will is a moral value. Now I'll defend this idea briefly. A world with free will is greater than a world without. It is better to choose love than to be forced to love. For love to be the greatest, it must be freely chosen. If you do not have the capacity to do evil, then you're basically a robot.
Okay, the first thing I notice about this premise is that it claims that free will is a moral value. Now, provided that free will is logically possible, if it can be proven that we don't have it, then you have actually fallen into another atheistic argument, which it could be called the problem of determinism. So how am I going to attempt to disprove free will? Well, my argument goes something like this. Everything we do is either chosen or involuntary, like one's heart beating. If it is involuntary, it is obviously not freely chosen. If it is chosen, our choices are determined by our own motives and preferences. Now, you have to ask the question, do we choose our motives? If not, then our choices are ultimately predetermined, whether our motives are causally determined or not. So this even applies if libertarian free will is true, then still true free will cannot exist. If so, then since changing one's motives is an action, it is either chosen or involuntary. If involuntary, then our decisions are still predetermined. If chosen, then the motives we choose to have must be predetermined from a first motive to terminate infinite regress, kind of like the idea of a first cause in arguments like the cosmological argument. Since this initial motive cannot have been chosen, it must be involuntary. Therefore, free will does not exist.
2. God cannot force free will. Free will by definition cannot be forced. If something is forced, it cannot be free. Even an all-powerful being cannot do the logically impossible. He cannot create a married bachelor, a square circle, pick up a rock so big he can't lift it, or force free will. 3. God is justified in creating a world with free will. It is better for God to create a world with free will than without it. A world with the greatest form of love is superior to a world of robots. 4. Free will allows the existence of evil. If creatures really have free will and God cannot force their actions, he cannot guarantee evil will not enter the world. By allowing free will, God makes evil possible. By using free will, man can make evil actual.
I don't really take issue with these three premises. I don't take issue with the second, third, or fourth premises to this argument. But I do have a question about free will with respect to heaven. In heaven, which is supposed to be the best possible world, where there is no suffering, where there is no misery, in heaven, do we have free will? If we do have free will, then wouldn't that make suffering entirely possible? And if we don't have free will, then wouldn't that imply that it's better to lack free will than it is to have it? I'd be interested in hearing what your answer to this question is.
Even God cannot do the logically impossible, or at least not the Christian perception of God. And I make an argument for this in my video called Omni versus Omni and Really Big Rocks. If you want to see that, I'll link to it in the more info section. Now, just to recap the argument one more time without explanation, free will is a moral value. God cannot force free will. God is justified in creating a world with free will, and free will allows the existence of evil. If this is indeed a possible scenario, then it is invalid to say that the existence of God and evil are logically impossible. Now, this answer is sufficient, but some people would reformulate the argument and claim that it is merely unlikely that God would be all-powerful, all-loving, and allow evil and suffering. This is known as the probabilistic or evidential problem of evil. Now, here the argument admits that evil is logically consistent with God, but argues that the sheer amount of evil makes God's existence improbable. Now, under this view, evil is broken into two forms, moral and natural evil. And moral evil is much easier to address. For example, some have argued that child rape disproves an all-loving God. But if men have free will, which an all-loving God would allow, then deplorable acts like child rape would be an act in which men could freely choose. In fact, the Bible predicts wickedness.
I've got another question for you about this. If it's immoral to interfere with anyone's free will, then wouldn't I be morally unjustified in preventing a deplorable act like child rape if I were to be capable of preventing it? If it's immoral for God to keep it from happening, and thus contradictory to his moral perfection, then why am I morally obligated to do so?
Natural evil, on the other hand, includes things which are not always clearly a direct result of man's choice to do wrong. These acts include things like earthquakes, volcanoes, birth defects, the common cold, a slow death of old age, and many other types of suffering. Now, to address this argument, that it is impossible that God would allow such a high level of moral and natural evil, a Christian would need to present some morally sufficient reasons for God to allow evil and suffering. So why would God allow this, or what reasons would he have that would justify allowing suffering? Now, before I begin listing some reasons I think explain this, I want to make sure everyone realizes that these are merely ideas or possibilities as to why God would allow this. These are just opinions and reasonings, and some of them could be in error. On the other hand, if even one of them is valid, then the evidential problem of evil loses its force. Alright, here we go. 1. God's purpose for humanity is not to provide them with an easy, convenient lifestyle. Eliminating suffering is not his purpose. Humanity's purpose in life is not happiness, but a knowledge of God and a relationship with God.
It may be the case that a morally perfect God would wish for humanity to know, love, and have a relationship with him more than he would want to end suffering, but this would only allow for suffering in cases where a loving relationship may be only achieved through suffering. However, for an all-loving God, situations like these would be rare, if not impossible. Also, this brings up another similar problem for theists, the problem of non-belief. If God wants us to have a loving relationship with him, there are ways by which God could easily do so, but doesn't. Lastly, if we don't have free will, as I think I established, then God would simply be able to establish a relationship with him as our strongest motive, thus solving the problem entirely.
The Bible tells us that because Adam and Eve disobeyed, they would suffer and life would not be convenient.
There are several problems here. Number one, there is absolutely no archaeological evidence for the existence of Adam and Eve, and evolution completely refutes the idea. Second, this would only justify God's punishing of Adam and Eve. Punishing everyone else, regardless of any possible wrongdoing, is both superfluous and sadistic. Third, even if, simply by the virtue of descending from Adam and Eve, we deserve suffering, what explains the fact that certain people suffer far more than others? Some people make it through life easily, almost never facing hardship, while others are condemned to immense suffering and misery, from the day they are born till the day they die. Even if we suffer because we deserve it, because two distant ancestors fucked up, we should all deserve equal suffering, without the incredible inequality we see around us.
Now, if they rebelled and God did not introduce suffering in the world, he would have been positively reinforcing their rebellion. If this is the case, humans may have avoided suffering, but rebellion from God would have been encouraged.
Okay, well, I do take issue with the idea that we deserve suffering merely because we refuse to follow an omnipotent dictator's every whim. Even if we grant that suffering was deserved, once again, we all should not be punished because of what true people did. Also, if you ask me, even a light slap on the wrists is far too great a punishment for merely eating an apple. And again, provided that we don't have free will, the idea that God would not be able to keep Adam and Eve from eating the fruit seems ludicrous. Couldn't he have just not created the fucking tree in the first place?
Which brings me to my second point. Although God's main goal is not for humanity to have a convenient lifestyle, in a way, an all-loving creator would want the greatest happiness for his creatures.
Then why didn't God just put us in heaven in the first place? If heaven leads to perfect happiness, then why make us go through this on earth? Is there any logical reason, especially given determinism? I don't think so.
In fact, that is likely why he allows free will, because love is best if freely chosen.
But we don't have free will, as I believe I have accurately demonstrated earlier in this video.
However, if God is truly loving and all-knowing, he would know that the greatest happiness can only be achieved through a knowledge and relationship with him.
Then why doesn't God show us that he exists? You can't have a relationship with something you don't believe exists. So it makes perfect sense for God to prove his existence to everyone. Or, once again, given determinism, simply put a relationship with God as one of our strongest motives, as I mentioned earlier.
In the end, human benefit is maximized. The Apostle Paul put it this way in 2 Corinthians 4:17, "For our light and monetary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all."
But still, an all-loving, morally perfect God would not desire his creation to go through any unnecessary suffering, even if it is light and momentary. Furthermore, this also brings up the problem of hell. What about the people who are atheists or Muslims or Jains or Buddhists or any other religion besides the right denomination of Christianity? They're not going to just have light and momentary troubles. In fact, because of the way they were, as I believe I have established, predetermined, they are going to suffer eternally, which is far from light and momentary, and definitely not something an all-loving God would want his creation to endure.
3. Suffering keeps people humble. It often points out their need for God.
Sure, suffering may make people more humble, but why didn't God simply make us more humble? Why didn't God create us that way? Or if you do find a way of rejecting and rebutting my argument for determinism, then why doesn't God simply reveal himself, making the threat of hell far more credible and thus making us far more humble? It simply does not make any sense.
The idea here is that suffering and finding God is a far superior position to never suffering and also never finding God. In fact, if suffering leads to a knowledge of God, then it leads to the greatest form of happiness. On the other hand, if lack of suffering deprives one of knowledge of God, it limits one from the greatest form of happiness.
Okay, I'm going to try a different argument here. I think I've indirectly at least addressed most of the things you bring up here, but I'm going to try something a little bit different. If you do argue that suffering does bring people to God, then why doesn't God make people who are wealthy and atheists suffer more? Why don't people who are atheists, who have a lot of money or who live a convenient lifestyle, why doesn't God make them suffer more so that they're more likely to become Christians? And on the other hand, why doesn't God make poor Christians suffer less? And up to the point where they'll stop caring about God, why isn't he simply make them have a better life? Furthermore, why doesn't God simply reveal himself, which would make everyone know and love God? I've already gone over that, but I feel the need to reiterate it again.
4. Without suffering, one cannot appreciate pleasure on the same level. If everything were filled with pleasure, then pleasure would become devalued. The contrast between suffering and pleasure gives pleasure a greater meaning. To address this objection before it comes, we will experience suffering on earth, but escape it in heaven. In heaven, we will experience only pleasure, but will be able to truly appreciate it, having knowledge of suffering from our time here on earth.
Okay, this argument is probably the first one I've seen in this video that's really a challenge to address. But I do think I have a good counter-argument, at least one good counter-argument. Alright, wouldn't the idea that suffering is necessary for us to value pleasure imply that there is some optimal level of suffering which would give us an understanding of what suffering is and the ability to experience pleasure, but would still